Okay, so later tonight, in a few hours' time, I'm going to be on a plane to India. So I'm going to be in a metal tube several thousand metres above the Earth's surface, completely out of control of the situation. And this evening I'm going to give a talk on fear and anxiety. Great timing. Okay, so every Tuesday night, if you stay for meditation, one thing that we do before meditation is we salute the shrine. And the first words that we say are Namo Buddhaya, which is I pay my respects to the Buddha. I salute the Buddha. So when we're doing that, we're paying respects to the ideal of the Buddha who represents the summit of human consciousness. So no one image can capture the depths and the heights and the breadth of that achievement. Another thing that we're doing is we're committing ourselves to try and move towards that ideal. So in one of our rituals, the words that we use are what the Buddha attained, we too can attain. What the Buddha overcame, we too can overcome. So we're in the middle of a series of talks looking at different qualities of the Buddha, different qualities of enlightenment. And so far we've looked at the qualities of wisdom, friendship, and empathy. And tonight I'm going to be talking about fearlessness. So the Buddha overcame fear, so we too can overcome fear. And there's a particular form of the Buddha who particularly brings out that aspect of fearlessness. He's called the Logosiddhi. And he shows the gesture of fearlessness, which is he puts his hand up like that. Fear comes this far and no further. And in one discourse, the Buddha, he describes the qualities of an enlightened being, and he said, one who is calmed, for which you can read one who is enlightened, one who is calmed, who has extinguished all clinging, who has no fixation about how things will end. Such a person has no fear. So fearlessness is one particular quality that's associated with the Buddha. And it's said that fearlessness is actually equivalent to enlightenment. So the very word fearlessness includes the word fear. So there could be no fearlessness if there hadn't been an experience of fear before that. So a large part of this talk, I'm going to be talking about fear and anxiety. Not long after I became an order member, I was at a chapter meeting. That's a meeting of other male order members. And I was talking about how I felt my whole life had been lived in relation to fear. That fear was almost the one defining feature, the thread that runs through everything. I talked about my experience as a gay teenager because of fear staying in the closet, out of genuine fear of violence and rejection. I was talking about how fear had dominated my life actually, and then we opened it out to everyone, and all the other men in the group said that they could understand what I had said. The same was true for them actually, that to a large extent their life had been defined by struggles with fear and anxiety. That had been the underlying theme. So I can be fairly confident that everybody in the room knows what I'm talking about, has had experiences of working with fear and anxiety. So I'm not going to ask you to give me an answer to this now, but just if I said the question, what do you fear? Just look into your minds and see what comes up. What do you fear? So when I asked myself this question, I did a little brainstorm, and it was quite a long brainstorm. Fear of death, fear of loss of faculties, fear of separation from loved ones, abandonment, rejection, fear of ending up alone, And also the opposite of that, in a way, fear of too much intimacy. It's fear of letting people get too close. Another theme was fear of loss of livelihood, loss of reputation, disgrace, downfall, what I could be capable of when I'm at my worst. A very common one, which applies to me too, is fear of public speaking. Not being good enough, letting people down. There's the fear of change, and there's also the fear of things not changing, stagnation. Fear of not being in control, fear of the unknown, fear of meaninglessness. And interestingly, one that came up was fear of the experience of fear itself. Anything to avoid that. So, fear pervades a lot of our lives. Well, I want to distinguish different types of fear. So, there are such things as healthy fear. So, there can be rational fear at a very ordinary human level. The fear that actually protects us. So that's our natural biological response to situations of danger, and such responses may have served us well. That impulse to fight or flight that protects us in situations of real danger, when our life's threatened or when we're under attack. If we're physically under attack, it's entirely understandable and forgivable to either fight back or run like the wind. I've always been in favour of run like the wind. And then there's ethical fear. Okay, so in Buddhism, there's such a thing as ethical fear. And this is a fear that genuinely moves us on, that spurs us on to spiritual development. So there's a sutta, there's a discourse with the Buddha, and he's recalling a time shortly after he got enlightened, shortly after his enlightenment experience. And he says, "Let me tell you now of the kind of dismay and terror that I have felt. Seeing people struggling like fish, writhing in shallow water with hostility towards one another, trapped in mutual conflict, I became afraid. Then I noticed something buried deep in their hearts. It was, I could just make it out, a dart. It is a dart that makes its victims run all over the place. But once it has been pulled out, all that running is finished, and all the exhaustion that comes with that is finished." So this is a response of fear towards unethical behaviour and the mental causes of that behaviour. So in Buddhism, fear can be seen as a painful but positive response to unethical states. It's obviously it's painful because we put ourselves in painful situations. But it's positive, that fear, because it gives us the urgency to do something about it. We just say to ourselves, I don't want to end up like this all the time. I don't want to do that again. Okay, so those are types of fear that can genuinely protect us or move us forward. But more often our fear is something that closes us down, actually. So it's not a genuine protection from actual danger. It's not in our best interests. And it doesn't inspire us to make a breakthrough. So we can experience that type of fear, irrational fear, as walls that confine us and limit us. And very often what was once a rational fear, a healthy fear, it started out life as some sort of response to a genuinely dangerous situation. It can become a stuck pattern. So, and when the conditions change, that pattern of responding just stays with us, becomes outdated. So earlier in my life, I worked in a children's project in India, in a village project, and there were foster families there looking after small children. And shortly after I started living there, I worked there for 3 years. A little boy turned up. He was called Robbie. I always felt very connected to Robbie, partly because he had a name very similar to my birth name, and also he's got the same birthday as me. And he arrived as a 1-year-old, and he was in a really, really bad way. He was extremely malnourished, We gave him worming tablets, and he just passed loads and loads of these huge round worms. Big pile. And so what happened was, when it came to dinner time, a panic came over him. So he just couldn't stop eating. So he would eat and eat and eat, and his stomach would become full, and he'd be in pain, but he just had to keep on eating. And there was fear on his face. And it was obviously an appropriate fear, because he'd just come from a situation where he didn't know where the next meal was coming from. That food could be the last food that he would have got. And what happened was, that carried on for years and years. It took him many, many years to outgrow that habit. He was in a place where there was lots and lots of food. He could have, whatever he wanted to eat, he could eat. And he did. And just memories of mealtime after mealtime where he'd be in tears because he was in pain because of having eaten so much. But if you took the food away, he'd be like terrified. Long outlives the actual situation itself, the situation of him not having enough food. So the conditions changed, but his response didn't change. So what was a very healthy, positive fear at the outset became something quite irrational. And that's quite an extreme situation, but it might be familiar to you that there's a pattern that's been set up, and you can look back earlier in life and understand why that pattern was set up. But in a way it doesn't apply now, but it still influences the way we behave. Okay, so we've said that one of the qualities of a Buddha is fearlessness. And the Buddha's fearlessness arose out of his previous experience of fear. So not long before he attained enlightenment, so very close to his enlightenment, we have a story in which the Buddha recalls an experience of fear. So this was 6 years after he'd left home, his privileged household life. He'd spent time with different teachers, he'd spent time doing extreme practices with fellow wanderers. And after all of that, he ended up on his own. And he felt, after all of that training, that he'd developed enough awareness, enough positivity, enough inner peace to enter the jungle alone, without getting overwhelmed. So he'd heard tales of others attempting this and going mad. So the terms that used in the sutra is people being robbed of their minds by fear. Which reminds me of my first solitary retreat. I went wild camping in the peaks for 4 days, and on the third day, so I was in some woods and about 100 yards from a stream, and on the third day I saw this bald head bobbing up and down out of the stream, and I was obviously very curious, and there was this guy, he was about 70, 75, and he was bathing in the stream, stark naked. And after some time, he got out of the stream, my side of the stream, and he started walking into the woods, stark naked. So I just moved a bit forwards and said, "Right, good afternoon." And then he walked back and he left. That night, what terrible terror of a naked 75-year-old axe-wielding maniac. This axe-wielding maniac is the patron saint of solitary retreats. So, wherever anyone's on a solitary retreat, there will be somebody hiding in the trees, potentially ready to leap. So definitely experience of me being robbed of my mind. He didn't come. So in this situation, so I'm going to call. So at this time he wasn't the Buddha, so his name was Gautama. So I'm going to refer to him as Gautama, which was his name before he became known as the Buddha. So Gautama, by going into the jungle alone, was setting himself a test, a formidable test. And he didn't just choose any old jungle. He chose a jungle near Gaia, which was associated with ghosts and spirits. And it wasn't just anywhere in that jungle. So he sought out particular notorious spots where trees surrounded by the bones of animals that had been sacrificed to appease the destructive forces of nature. He describes them as places of fear and dread, awe-inspiring, horrifying abodes. And he didn't just pick any time to go into the jungle. He went there on particular nights that were associated with those places being most terrifying. So he's obviously deliberately setting himself a challenge. And this is what he recalls. There in the darkness, I would hear an animal approaching, or a peacock would break off a twig, or the wind would rustle the fallen leaves, and I thought, is this it, coming now? The fear and dread. So Gautama was deliberately facing threatening forces, and he was plumbing the depths of his own mind that led him to fear those forces. He was facing his fears in order to see through them, to break through them. And it sounds like he was relishing this confrontation, but it seems that he had some doubts. So this is the bit I find most funny of the sutta. At this he says, "What am I doing here, wanting this to happen?" I know the feeling. And terror was said to come again and again in waves, pulsing through him. But Gautama did manage to control his mind. He refused to be deflected from whatever he was doing. So when he was sitting, he carried on sitting. When he was lying down, he carried on lying down. When he was walking, he carried on walking. And when he was standing, he carried on standing. And he let the fear come and go. I faced that fear and dread just as it found me, and I drove it out. So you get a real sense of Gautama entering into fear. He comes across as heroic, his warrior energy blazing up, courage and determination roused. And at the end of this experience, he says, tireless energy was aroused in me, and unremitting mindfulness. My mind became tranquil and untroubled. So facing fears with courage and determination bears fruits. It's actually a vital part of spiritual growth. And we may not put ourselves in such extreme situations, but we do find ourselves in challenging situations which provoke fear and anxiety. And it's important not to spend our lives avoiding those sorts of situations. So when we find ourselves in those situations, how do we work with that? What lessons can we learn from Gautama's trial in the jungle? So this is where the flip chart comes in. This is not a formal Buddhist list, this is an informal Maitridasa list based on Buddhist principles. Okay, so the first thing we can do is stand our ground. So Gautama didn't run away, though the thought clearly seemed to cross his mind. So the first thing that we have to do is not panic. So when fear surges up, when we get that initial flash of fear, we may not be able to do anything more constructive than just stay there. And at that time, what we can do is we can bring to mind the truth of impermanence, have confidence in impermanence, that this will come and this will go. And when that initial wave has run through us, or that series of waves, things will start to settle down and we will get a bit more perspective. So first step, stand your ground. Don't panic. And then in this sutta we saw that Gautama looked right into the face of his fears. So he stared his fear in the face. And he tried to see his fears for what they were. Is this it coming now? The fear and the dread. And he began to notice his reactions. So past experiences resurfaced from early in his life. Distractions arose. Doubts came in his mind. Stories about the future came in his mind. But he just learned to notice the thoughts and emotions as a flow of mental states flowing through him. And to see that some of those mental states were more beneficial than others. So when I first started teaching on the introductory course, which most of you will have come through, so that's a couple of years ago now, so obviously I had quite a bit of nerves and anxiety about that, but there was one particular week, it was week 4, and I think there's some people here who are on that course. I think Martin was on that course. And I was sitting down there, It wasn't my turn to speak, and I was paralysed with fear. So the first one didn't come into it because I couldn't actually move. So I did have to sit on the ground. And I just sort of had to look into it. I had to look into what was happening. And the first thing that I realised was, I'm afraid. This is fear. Is this it coming? The fear and the dread. So then I stayed with that feeling, okay, I'm afraid. And then out of that came a realisation, I'm afraid of all of these people. I'm afraid of all of these people that I don't know. And because I don't know them, it means that they're probably hostile and that they might hurt me. So that's obviously something from my past conditioning that's outdated, but was coming up very strongly in that situation. The next week, week 5, I had hardly any fear at all. So there was something about that process that I went through that week, which was about experiencing the fear, naming it as fear, and getting some idea of where that was coming from, that actually largely dispelled the fear. So we can name fear as fear, and then begin to engage our rational minds and investigate what's going on. This process of rational investigation and discrimination is the key to deciding how we want to act. So the next one on my list is making a choice. So which mental states, if acted upon, will lead to more suffering, will lead to stagnation? And which mental states, if acted upon, will lead to progress, to happiness, for myself and others? So we're not only victims of our past conditioning. Obviously our past conditioning influences us a lot, but we can choose to create our future, a more open, expansive future, less dominated and less restricted by fears. And we can start to paddle against the stream of our self-centeredness. We can choose to act more selflessly, with love and kindness and generosity and compassion. So I'll tell a story about my father, which I've mentioned in a previous talk. Some of you won't have heard it. And this was a time a few years ago, and he was in hospital and he was having a life-threatening operation. He'd been ill for quite a lot of years, and this was one more operation. And I went to see him the day before the operation, and he was obviously afraid. He was obviously very sobered by looking into his mortality, into fear of death. He's a devout Christian, and he was reading the Psalms. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death. And it's very touching to see him so sort of shaken up by the fear of his mortality. And then I went to see him the day after his operation, and the operation had gone well. It was a leg amputation, but it had gone well. And his response to that was remarkable. He'd obviously been reflecting on life. He'd obviously, that experience of facing his own mortality had given him some clarity, some urgency about his life. And he'd overnight made the decision to go into care to prevent my mum having to keep looking after him. And another thing he said was, we're all a bit emotionally repressed in this family, and that's probably my fault. But from now on, whenever we meet each other, we're all going to hug. And ever since, we all have. So overnight, this has completely changed the family dynamic. So yeah, in that situation, out of that experience of great fear, my father took responsibility. He took responsibility for himself. Taking responsibility for ourselves takes great courage, but it can be a great gift to others. You know, an act of selflessness can really help us to overcome fear. The next one on my list, rallying support. So Goto in the jungle, he went through his experience alone because he felt ready to do so. He felt that he was ready to go into the jungle alone, but we don't have to go through it alone. So when we have experiences where we're feeling a lot of fear and anxiety, we can share our experiences openly with friends. And we can seek out friends and just open that out. And we can also draw on the support of our ideals. And traditionally that's described as going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. And there's a line from one of the longer rituals that we do, which is, "Till now I have ignored the teachings, but seeing what awaits me, I go now for refuge, so my fear may be banished." So traditionally the act of going for refuge is seen as an antidote to fear. Really committing ourselves to spiritual practice can be a refuge from fear. Okay, so shortly after Gautama's trial in the jungle, he attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and part of this experience seems to have been decisively breaking through fear into a state of complete fearlessness. It's a state that's very difficult to imagine. We can maybe imagine times when we've felt less fearful than others, but to imagine a complete absence of fear is very difficult to imagine, beyond our comprehension. This is not just courage in the face of fear, it's the absence of fear altogether. And there's many examples of the Buddha's fearlessness in the Pali Canon. Fearlessness in the face of his impending murder at the hands of a ruthless murderer. Fearlessness right up to the end of his life, actually. So when he was very old and close to death, he seemed to have remained completely calm. He did what needed to be done. He taught as many people as possible. He addressed lots of people's concerns about the future of the Sangha. And he encouraged and reassured lots of people. So he seemed to be putting others first all the time. His own fear didn't come into it. He was fearless. And his very last words before his parinirvana, his passing on, were, "It is the nature of all things to dissolve. With mindfulness, strive on." So this seems to have been one last urge to his disciples to rouse their warrior spirit. He was full of kindness and concern for them, but blended with uncompromising truth. It's the nature of all things to dissolve, to pass. With mindfulness, strive on. And there's a particular incident earlier in the Buddha's life which shows his fearlessness very well. And this happened when he was 72, so quite old. And his own cousin, who's called Devadatta, was trying to usurp him. So his cousin had become a monk, was part of the Sangha, and he'd gone a bit wrong, according to the suttas, and he was trying to usurp the Buddha. And he'd urged the king of that land to have the Buddha assassinated. They sort of forged an alliance. So the first thing that the king did was he sent a series of armed men to assassinate the Buddha. And what happens in every situation, as soon as the men got close enough to actually have a sense of the Buddha's presence, they weren't able to do the deed. There was something about the Buddha which just meant that they couldn't do it. And then the next thing that happened was Devadatta himself tried himself to kill the Buddha by rolling a huge rock down onto the Buddha while he was doing walking meditation. That didn't work. It almost worked, but not quite. And when that happened, the disciples were in uproar. They were chattering, they were pacing up and down, they were chanting verses of protection. But the Buddha told them in no uncertain terms, "Go to your dwelling places. A Buddha needs no protecting." So the next thing that happened is that Devadatta bribed some men to attack the Buddha with a savage man-killing elephant. So this was a notorious elephant in the neighbourhood called Nalagiri. So, Devadatta bribed them with wage increases and improving their situation, promotion. And shortly after that, the Buddha was on his begging round, and so the men they brought Nalagiri, the elephant, into the street and they let it loose. So the description is that the elephant raised his trunk, his ears and his tails were erect, and he charged towards the Buddha. So the disciples, seeing this elephant coming, were horrified, and they urged the Buddha to turn back. Get out! Run! The Buddha's reply, come monks, do not be afraid. But they keep on urging him. And there would have been lots of laymen, householders nearby, and they were in suspense. Some of them were really, really afraid for the Buddha. He who is so handsome, they said, he who is so handsome will get hurt. Others seem to have had more confidence. They said, soon Tusker will be contending with Tusker. Tusker. So the Buddha's response, he faced the elephant head on, and he encompassed the elephant with thoughts of loving kindness. And when the Buddha, like the armed guards, as soon as the Buddha got close enough, got a sense of that, he slowed down, lowered his trunk, and stood in front of the Buddha. And then the words in the sutta that the Buddha says to the elephant are, have done with vanity and recklessness. The reckless have no happy future. And then the elephant, quite tamely, returns back to his stables. And there's a verse that goes with this sutta. It says, some tame with sticks and whips. The great sage has tamed using neither. So this story could be seen as a straightforward demonstration of the Buddha's fearlessness. It could also be taken as a symbol of the Buddha's victory over fear itself. So he stares into that fear with a face, stares it in the face with loving kindness. Completely confident, established in the truth, unshakable, completely in tune with the nature of reality, how things really are. Which brings us to the last on the list, which is actually getting to the root of the matter, getting to the root of fear. So part of the Buddha's enlightenment experience, part of the wisdom experience of enlightenment for him was he saw that self-centeredness was the root of all suffering. Self-clinging was the root of all suffering, all bondage. And he taught that when we cling to an idea of ourselves as fixed and separate and very, very important and at the centre of the universe, that inevitably gives rise to fear. So our teacher, Sangha Night, who founded this order, has something to say about this. He says that every living thing feels that it is an individual speck of selfhood, floating perilously on the hostile waters of whatever is not self. This naturally brings us into conflict with some of the other millions of struggling selfhoods, endeavouring to do the same thing. The Buddha taught clearly that without breaking down the narrow walls which divide self from not self, there can be no peace in our hearts. So there can be no fearlessness. So the path to weakening this fixed view of ourselves, this view of ourselves as fixed and separate and highly important, and the path to acting in ways that reflect the truth of interconnectedness, that is the path to overcoming fear. So while day to day we do experience ourselves as having a sense of a discrete self, the Buddha saw that ultimately this is an illusion. The more we hold tightly to that illusion, the more fear we will experience. And the more we can let go of holding so tightly to ourselves and relating to others openly, kindly, generously, the more liberation from fear we will experience. So in times when fear arises, we can bring the wisdom of the Buddha to mind to get to the root of the matter. This is where I get Buddhist listening. You would all have come across, partly because it was on the introductory course and partly because Bodhanaga had it in the talk recently. So these are the three lakshanas, the three marks of conditioned existence. Unsatisfactoriness, impermanence, and non-selfhood. So in situations when we're sort of assailed by fear and anxiety, we can bring these wisdoms to bear. We can remind ourselves that such fear is an inevitable consequence of how we live our lives. That is part of the unsatisfactoriness of lives, is the experience of fear and anxiety. We can remind ourselves of impermanence, This fear will pass. Let it come, let it go, let it come again, let it go again. This fear will pass. And we can remind ourselves that this experience does not define us as a fixed being. So we can remind ourselves that this is not who I am. This is not essentially myself. This experience of fear is not essentially who I am. So the very things we look to for security tend to give rise to fear, to more fear. So the more we see ourselves at the centre of the universe and cling on to ourselves and our possessions, the more we will fear the loss of that. So there's another story about a companion of the Buddha called Bhaddiya, another of his disciples. And it seems to be that he had a habit of, while he was doing whatever he was doing, he would cry out, "Oh bliss! Oh bliss!" And the other monks were a bit unnerved by this. What's going on? Why does he keep saying "oh bliss"? So this particular monk, before he became a monk, he was a member of the royal family, the aristocracy, and he'd lived in complete luxury. And they suspected that he was remembering experience of the past when he'd had great luxury and privilege, and shouting out, "Oh, what bliss, what bliss." So they go to the Buddha, they tell the Buddha what's going on, share their suspicions, and finally the Buddha calls Bhaddiya and asks him why he keeps exclaiming, "Oh bliss." And he says, "In the past, although I was guarded and protected, I lived agitated, distrustful and afraid. But now, on going alone to some empty place in the forest, I am fearless, confident, free from inner turmoil." So, Bhaddiya had, in the past, he'd had a lot. He'd lived in palaces behind great walls. Wherever he went, he would have been surrounded by guards, and his experience was agitation, suspicion and fear. And on the contrary, when he'd renounced all of that and in a way took refuge in the Three Jewels and just took pleasure in places of solitude, he experienced fearlessness. So the less guarded and self-protective our lives become, the less we will have to fear. Okay. So, concluding soon, 5 more minutes. So ingrained fear, habits influenced by ingrained fear often keep us rigid, almost frozen. They can cramp us, limit us, cut us off, and they can block our growth. But fear can also be a sign of progress. So if we are committed to practicing effectively, we will be pushing at the boundaries of our habits, pushing out our old stories, challenging our self-centeredness. Then, like Gautama in the jungle, fear will come out into the open. It will be challenged, and then we can do something about it. We can face it with courage. We can stand our ground. We can stare it in the face. We can choose how to act, and if necessary, rally support. We can relish it. Courage, facing fears can be something to relish. Whilst, like the Buddha, we might think, "What am I doing here waiting for this to happen?" We might always might relish it as a challenge, welcome it as a sign that we're coming alive, starting to wake up. And that's when new possibilities open up for us. So this is the path of the warrior. The path of the warrior is not a path of avoiding fear. It's not being dictated to by fear. It's a path of relating to life directly. Starting to come alive, starting to wake up. So the warrior doesn't hide from the facts of existence and doesn't fight the facts of existence either. The fact that life is unpredictable. Things won't always turn out the way that I want them to. Everything is impermanent. We are going to die. We are not that important. These are uncontrovertible facts of existence. So the warrior welcomes fear, and he sees fear as a teacher, and he allows fear to build courage and confidence and to move forward. And facing fear not only rouses our courage, it opens the way to loving and serving others more deeply, more effectively. So it takes courage to put aside what we want to do and what we think about things and do whatever the situation demands, devoting ourselves to the benefit of the situation, to the benefit of others. So ultimately, a being who achieves total fearlessness, like the Buddha, will express that spontaneously as compassion, as compassionate activity. And one of the words that's used for compassion in the Pali Canon is literally translated as trembling with others. Trembling with others. So rather than trembling with fear for ourselves, fearlessness leads us into trembling with compassion for others. An enlightened being, a Buddha, one who has achieved fearlessness, will share that fearlessness freely as a gift, devoting their lives to helping others to overcome their fears, find freedom from suffering, and develop confidence. So as Gautama experienced, all alone in the jungle, facing fear and dread, may courage and confidence be aroused in us. May our minds become untroubled. May we tremble with compassion for each other, and together do what we can to dispel the sufferings of the world.